We do have a crisis, but we also have, from my mind, a clear moral and legal compass that we need to follow. We have a refugee crisis on our southern border, which I would argue requires an emergency response domestically and the urgent recalibration of our foreign policy. Why do I say that? Because as I have argued for several years in the Foreign Relations Committee, that the continuous cuts that we have had in the programs that are in our national interests, in our national security, was going to bring us a day in which we would rue the consequences of those cuts. And so here we are with Honduras having the #1 murder rate per capita in the world, and the other two Central American countries from which these children are fleeing in the top 5 in the world. And, as Senator Nelson so well spoke about, the whole question of the narcotics trafficking that is taking place using this as a via to the United States where the demand is, and the total inability of these countries to deal with entities that have more money and very often have more firepower than any of the national governments that are engaged. And then add to that the dynamic and explosive growth of gangs, and I'm talking about gangs that are armed and fueled with money in a symbiotic relationship with the drug traffickers that creates a challenge. In one of these countries, it went from 600 to 40,000 members of a gang. Now, this isn't about some far-off place. This is right here, in our own front yard, in our hemisphere, in a very relative short distance. So unless we deal with the root causes of these problems, there will be no resources or any change in law that is going to ultimately meet the challenge of those who flee because to stay is to die. So that's the challenge we have before us. But we have to deal with that challenge in our southern border, and our distinguished chair of the Appropriations Committee has fashioned a package that I think is balanced and seeks to do that. But just as important as we deal with this refugee crisis, in my view, is equally important that we don't rush to change our laws in a way that strips children of the very rights for which we have been known as a country. I'm not even talking about the 2008 law. I'm talking about the very essence of our immigration law for decades that has asylum as a fundamental pillar. It's imperative to understand that this is a desperate effort by desperate parents to do what any parent would do to protect their child from violence and the threat of death. Imagine the circumstances that a parent must be in to send an 8-year-old 2,000 miles on a treacherous journey where all things can happen to them in the hope that they can arrive and make a claim for asylum, but not knowing whether their child will actually be able to arrive alive. That's some dramatic choice, but that's the choices facing these parents. These children are facing tremendous threats. Towns and schools controlled by narcotic traffickers, gangs threatening to kill them, rapes and murders. In the Foreign Relations Committee recently, we held a hearing, and I noted a piece that was written in the New York Times by Pulitzer Prize-winning author Sonia Nazario, who testified before the committee. And this is to give the Senate the sense of what we're talking about here. A young boy named Cristiano Omar Reyes, a 6th grader. His father was murdered by gangs while working as a security guard. 3 people he knows have been murdered this year. 4 others were gunned down on a corner near his house in the first 2 weeks of this year. A girl his age was beaten, had a hole cut in her throat, her body left in a ravine across from his house. Christian said, "It's time to flee." Or Carlos Bacadaño, a 14-year-old who worked in a dump picking scrap metal when he was a boy, making $1 or $2 a day. When he was 9 years old, he barely escaped 2 drug traffickers who were trying to rape him. When he was 10, the drug traffickers pressured him to try drugs and join the gang or die. He has known 8 people who were murdered, 3 killed in front of him. In one case, he watched as 2 hitmen brazenly shot 2 young brothers execution style. Going to school is even too dangerous for him now. These stories are not, unfortunately, unique. They are tragic stories of life-changing experiences that too many children face in Central America every day. Children like Christian and Carlos, whose stories are unknown but no less tragic. Mr. President, let me take a moment to repeat that I strongly oppose changing existing law. The answer is not to repeal the law that keeps these children safe and gives them an opportunity. That's all the law gives them, an opportunity to determine whether their status here can be adjusted under asylum. The answer is not to deny these children their day in court and send them back to very probable death. But those who want to repeat the 2008 law would be doing exactly that. If we provide the funding the government needs, the administration has the authority to deal with the crisis in a safe and humane way without turning our back on the rule of law that we pride as a nation. Anti-trafficking organizations have explained to me that this trafficking law was designed by both Republicans and Democrats in broad bipartisan efforts to give special protections to children who cannot adequately represent themselves and who often do not self-identify as victims of abuse, crime, or human trafficking. Congress sought to provide special protections for those who have fled thousands of miles in recognition of the fact that a larger percentage of these children may have very compelling and legitimate claims. Unfortunately, the Border Patrol's cursory review of Mexican children claims often results in a failure to identify children who are at risk of persecution or trafficking, according to the UN Commissioner for Refugees. Extending this type of superficial screening to Central American children would certainly mean serious abuse or death upon their return. We can keep this important anti-trafficking law and at the same time address the situation on the border. Now, let me explain how the administration already has the authority to control this crisis. Critics have complained that the 2008 trafficking law requires children to be released into the community. But what the law actually says is that children need to be held in a manner that is in, quote, the best interests of the child. In this situation, when we are dealing with an influx of thousands of children, it is clearly in the best interest of these children to hold them in a safe and clean shelter rather than returning them to face possible death or quickly releasing them into the hands of a sponsor who may not be properly vetted. Failure to properly screen these children could result in children being returned to their very traffickers. Critics have also complained that deportation hearings don't take place for years after the children arrive, and that this creates an incentive for children to come to the United States. But the law allows the Justice Department to hold hearings much more quickly, without denying due process, by moving recently arriving children and families to the front of the line for hearings before a judge. As the Justice Department testified last week before the Appropriations Committee hearing, that's exactly what they're doing, surging resources and expediting full hearings. These expedited process that still protects due process would send a signal to parents in Central America that children without valid claims. And there will be a significant universe that will not have a valid claim and will be deported, will not be able to stay in the United States. But at the same time, it would protect the rights of legitimate refugees and trafficking victims. So while not every single child apprehended at the border will have a valid claim to stay in the country, and many will be deported, we have a moral and a legal obligation to keep them safe until their status is resolved. The answer is not to repeal the law that protects them, but to enforce it and to provide the administration with the resources it requested to address both the domestic and international aspects of this crisis. Now, this problem wasn't created overnight, and it won't be solved overnight. But the solution is not to abandon our values and the rule of law that we uphold as an example to other nations, so that every child will be safe wherever they may live. If we do this now, I can tell you, I don't know how we will have any authority to look at any other country in the world and say to them that you must accept refugees from Syria, you must accept refugees from the Congo, the Dominican Republic, you must accept refugees from Haiti, and the list goes on and on. There is a reason why this law was passed. It was passed to say if you're fleeing 2,000 miles to try to come to the United States, there may be a greater probability that you have a real case to be made for asylum because you have a credible fear for the loss of your life. Which under our law, as I hear those who advocate for the rule of law, I say you're right. The rule of law means you just don't undermine the law or change it when you don't want to ultimately live under it. You obey it. You obey it. Now, if you flee 2,000 miles and you were told by the gangs, join or die, or if you were raped and you flee 2,000 miles never to experience that tragic and traumatic circumstances again, you have a really compelling case. So let me close by saying the fact of the matter is that there are some who are exploiting this issue for political gain. Some who could not even see their way to cast a vote or to allow a vote on the type of comprehensive immigration reform the Senate passed on a broad bipartisan basis, in which both border control and human trafficking and all of these other issues that we are now facing would have had the resources and would be addressed. I also find it incredible to see the governor of Texas saying he's going to send the National Guard to the border. What does the National Guard going to do in what is otherwise a federal law enforcement obligation with Border Patrol agents who ultimately are obviously interdicting these young people, and they're actually turning themselves over to them? What is the National Guard with rifles going to do at the Texas border that Border Patrol can't do themselves? This supplemental bill is almost entirely for enforcement of the law, and I know that Republicans have been saying for years they want more money for enforcement of immigration law. Well, folks, here it is. Here it is. And I just cannot believe that the resources that are going to the very states that say they face a challenge, that there will be those who will vote against it. I can't believe that just because the president is proposing it, they can't ultimately find their way to vote for the money that's going to go largely to the states that face the most critical challenge at this time. So that's what our immigration debate has come to. We began this Congress with an overwhelming bipartisan vote in favor of common sense immigration reform, and here we are, unwilling to even provide something that I've never voted for but will, strictly enforcement funding. And we have Republicans calling for Dreamers to be deported as part of this bill in the House of Representatives, and a rollback of legislation to protect small children from human trafficking. That's what we've come to. Now, those who want to roll back this law, which passed with broad bipartisan support in both houses of the Congress and signed by a Republican president, is not something I can personally accept, and I will use the procedures of the Senate, I hope with others who feel the same, if that is a choice that has to come before us, not to permit that to happen. The president has the authority to control this crisis already. Let's give him the resources to do the job, and let us, in the process of doing that, not create a dark day in our nation's history, which we will regret for years to come. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.